Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is a 10-minute Bible Hour podcast. What are we doing here? In Matthew 17. We're talking about the coin. We're talking about the coin that Jesus was saying you're going to have to pay for the temple tax. And then after that, there's a fish involved. And we got to get to the fishing part because I think that's going to be a lot of fun. So to reset, there's this tax that got instituted all the way back in the Old Testament. What do we say that was? Exodus chapter 30. It was something like that. It was a long time ago. And from this passage, we learn that as a ransom that the Jewish people were supposed to pay for God buying them back out of slavery, buying them back out of Egypt, but probably also a spiritual element, buying them back from death and judgment. They were to pay this tax, which in first century AD terms is a 2 drachma tax. We spent a little bit of time trying to think about exactly how much money that was. If you convert that out to modern day silver prices, we're like, is it like $10 or something? That's not really that much, but it looks like maybe the valuation of silver back in the day would put that at a couple days' wages kind of number. Whatever the case, you got to pay this amount. It looks like, according to Exodus 30, you pay this amount one time in life, but we can tell clearly from extra biblical sources and from what we're getting here in Matthew chapter 17 that this became an annual expectation for men, I believe, over the age of 20 to pay for the life of the temple. And the temple system was this gigantic, elaborate system that didn't just involve a great big building and a great big staff to perform all of these rituals and sacrifices and everything else, but it also had to be elaborate enough to support all of the individuals who came in to do their own personal sacrifices. Well, this gets a little bit tricky when you're talking about multiple competing currencies. You're talking about some sliding scale stuff that existed within the law, wiggle room, allowances for some people being a little poorer, a little richer in terms of what kind of thing you sacrifice. It's easy for us, as we look back on this, to imagine that it was just like it was a church. It was kind of a big church, and any institution we look at from the outside, we're generally going to underestimate its complexity. But when we look more closely at, again, the biblical and extra-biblical sources about what the temple system was, oh, dang! This was a gigantic thing that required a ton of work and a ton of money to maintain and a ton of intellectual energy to maintain, to think about how to make this equitable and that equitable and things that seem totally trivial to us. Well, I mean, those matter a lot to people who are actually in the moment, and things being fair becomes important because you're going to be getting feedback from all of your different parishioners or customers or whatever you want to call it. And it had a very far-reaching influence as Jewish people were scattered all over the place, but especially in Judea and Galilee. This is the home tax base. These are the people who need to pay the bills, and there isn't really a great make money system implicitly built in, baked into the temple system. So the temple tax persists, the temple tax becomes annual, and temple tax collectors get sent out like bell ringers once a year in the spring to go to all these various towns and set up booths and collect the temple tax and make sure they check the list and get everybody signed off on, and then you got a year of templing that's paid for. And so in Matthew 17, Jesus is coming back from the Transfiguration, and he gets met with this when he goes back into Capernaum. The collectors of the 2 drachma tax, that's the temple tax, came to Peter and asked, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" "Yeah, he does," he replied. And when Peter came back into the house, Jesus was the first to speak, as we discussed yesterday. He said, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own sons or from others?" And Peter says, "From others." Then Jesus says, "Then the sons are exempt. But so that we may not offend them, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you'll find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours." Now, yesterday we wrapped up thinking about the theological implications of this thing. And the reason I started the conversation we're having right now with this attempt to describe how big the institution of the temple was to juxtapose it against the theological meaning that we talked about yesterday that Jesus seems to be throwing out. What he seems to be saying is this big, gigantic institution that you all cannot imagine going away, that you all cannot imagine being handled differently, is something I'm actually actively pushing back on. if you really think through the implications of this new family of faith that is being founded in Christ, it does offer a fulfillment, a completion of what is happening at the temple. At the temple, they're sacrificing stuff for sins. Now, there are other sacrifices as well. We broke that down in an earlier episode. You can go back and catch that. All you have to do is just scrub through literally 400 podcast episodes, and I'm sure you'll find the one that I'm talking about. But there's this substitutionary aspect to the temple system, to the sacrificial system, whereby your sin is addressed, the wrath of God is stayed by this sacrifice happening in your stead. But Jesus has dropped pretty serious hints that he is the ultimate sacrifice. And in the home stretch in the book of Matthew, it's going to become abundantly clear that he views himself as the ultimate perfect sacrifice once and for all for the sins of humankind. And if you have any questions after Matthew, just read the rest of the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament. It is explicit that that is exactly what Jesus did. He came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many, to take the sins of the world upon him, to be that sacrificial lamb, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And so if God is making a new family of faith through Jesus, and if Jesus is going to be the ultimate once and for all sacrifice, and Jesus is going to be the ultimate mediator between God and man, he will be the go-between, not some kind of priesthood, then, well, that is a threat to the temple system. It is, some would say, an undoing. I think Jesus would say, I think Matthew would say, I know I would say, a completion, a fulfillment of all of the things that are true and theologically born out of the Old Testament of the temple system. So, yeah, your father's the king. That's your house. Why would he extract money from you? We don't need to pay for this system to go on. So is Jesus abolishing any kind of donating to church? Well, I mean, I don't think so, because you get over further into the New Testament and you see Paul going around and taking up an offering. And for whatever reason, Luke in the book of Acts keeps referencing like, we got this offering and we had to go and deliver it to this church that was in need. It comes up in some of the letters as well. There's some instruction on how to collect the resources that come in and are shared. So it sure doesn't look like Jesus is abolishing paying for things that are required as a practical necessity to make church or religious stuff go. What it looks like he's saying is that theologically, the entire temple system is being fulfilled in him. But we got a ways to go, and if you skip all the way to the end, you have a problem. It's like, think about whatever your ideology is. When you go and talk to people, if you're someone who attempts to be apologetic, not like I'm sorry, but like you're making an argument for this being a good way to think about politics and philosophy and morality, you probably don't come out and say the most shocking thing you can possibly think of to say that is a slogan for your ideology. When you meet somebody on the plane, you're like, oh, so what do you do for a living? Well, I am an accountant. Cool. I'm a YouTuber. Taxation is theft. It's not helpful. You're not going to get anywhere. If I want to convince people that maybe taxation policy is something that has gotten a little out of hand and we should rethink, I want to take the real slow road to that and find points of moral agreement where I can, and ultimately we'll land where we land, and me throwing out hardcore, dramatic, overwrought slogans isn't going to help anybody, and it creates a vulnerability on a topic like that because it's a complex topic. Well, here, if Jesus comes into the world and he's like, hello, is this on? Hi, I'm Jesus. You may have heard I was recently baptized and that God showed up. Hey, I just wanted to let you know why I'm here. It's to wreck your temple. There's no need for it anymore. I think we're done with that. It's served its purpose, so follow me and let's move on from the temple thing. It ain't going to work. The whole movement, it's not going to get momentum because in people's brains, it's like, well, it's sacred to us. It's precious to us. This is how we interact with God. You can't mess with the temple system. This is like the one thing that's actual real estate. It's physical. It's the tangible thing that we have as a point of connection between us and God. But there's a little bit of a slow roll on some of these topics. And indeed, the accusation that Jesus was against the temple is what, in the most technical of senses, is going to get him killed down the road. Therefore, at this point in the game, it just does not make sense to go hardcore slogans about the temple. Instead, he's like, okay, inside baseball. Guys, are we to a place where we get this now? You are part of this new family of faith. Your father is the king. That is his house. You're starting to understand where this is going. Therefore, you don't really need to go and pay this tax long term. That is being fulfilled and completed, but we're not there yet. And it's important that maybe we still show some concern to how people would interpret this. We're not here to intentionally just create confusion and cause this whole thing to come to a head this second. There's a due time for that. All of this paraphrases mind. Therefore, so that we don't unnecessarily offend them to no good ends, go to the lake and throw out your line. Wouldn't you expect that sentence is going to be, okay, but so we don't offend them. Here, hang on a second. Let me see what I got in my pocket. Oh yeah, I found this in the wash. That should be enough for you and me. Go give it to him. Instead, he harkens back to this theme we've seen throughout his teachings, throughout Matthew, of provision. And he's like, just go to the water and throw a line in the drink. Now, it's kind of fun. I think this is the only part of the Bible or the only part of the New Testament where we get a story about somebody fishing the way I like to fish, with a line. So I choose to imagine that he's got a 9-foot 4-weight rod and that he's got his line in his left hand. He's casting overhand in his right hand. He gets a nice long cast. That fly just sits up perfectly at the end of that tapered leader, and that tilapia on the Sea of Galilee just couldn't resist, and it came up and it took it, and God supernaturally ordained exactly which fish would most quickly get to the surface. Peter raises the rod, sets that hook perfectly, has a short battle, but that tilapia is quickly exhausted, reels the thing in, and then boom, the coin is right there. It is interesting, though, because we don't actually get an account as to whether this worked out. I have to assume it did work out, or else Matthew wouldn't include this in the text, because it would make Jesus look real dumb and bad. Meaning, I guess this is kind of an open-ended thing. What do you call this anecdote? Is it a miracle? I'm going to assume that it's a miracle, because I'm going to assume that it worked out and that the provision that we've already seen Jesus talk about so much throughout the book of Matthew came through here as well. Give us this day our daily bread. Don't worry about what's going to happen tomorrow. Tomorrow's enough worries of its own. Look at the lilies of the field if God can take care of them. Look at the birds of the air if God can take care of them. He can take care of you. Who, with worrying, can add a single day to his life? Everything points to the idea that part of who God is the provider, and that any provision that does come is from this good and benevolent king. And so I think the theological meaning of the implied, obviously fly fishing miracle here is that even your very salvation, your very connectedness with God, which is what paying the temple tax buys you. It buys you proximity to God. It buys you access to the sacrificial system and the forgiveness of God. Even the very forgiveness of God, even salvation, even proximity to God is not earned by you going out and doing all of the hard work. It's gained, rather, at the most foundational level by the provision and grace and generosity of God. What a fun, strange, oft-forgotten little passage. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.